Hello, members and friends of the UBC migration community. Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Amanda Cheong, and I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department here at UBC, and I am honored to be serving as your host for today's seminar. Before we begin, we're going to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I also recognize that many of you may be joining us today from many places near and far, and therefore would like us all to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. And given the recent violence and intimidation of Mi'kmaq fishers and community members in Nova Scotia and other countless ongoing injustices, it's important that those of us who are settlers understand that these land acknowledgements are not merely platitudes, but are rather opportunities for us to affirm our commitments to supporting the process of reconciliation through our learning and our actions. Now, in the effort of emulating the extent that we can, the dialogical spirit of the UBC Migration Seminar Series, we're going to try to make this session as interactive as possible. So firstly, please follow UBC Migration on Twitter if you haven't already done so. Our Twitter handle is up on the PowerPoint slide here and is at UBC Migration. And also, please feel free to tweet and tag us throughout the talk. Second, attendees are encouraged to ask questions and can do so throughout the course of this talk or during the Q&A session using the chat function right here in Zoom. Questions that get submitted will be viewable by the entire audience. So if you're shy, don't worry, you have the option of submitting a question anonymously. And you also have the option of upvoting questions that you'd be particularly interested in being asked. Our presenter today has also welcomed you to ask clarifying questions at any point throughout the talk. And thirdly, although this event is being recorded, we'll be stopping the recording during the Q&A session. Now it is my privilege to be introducing Dr. Young Zhou, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at UBC. Dr. Zhou earned her PhD in politics from Princeton University in 2019, and her research focuses on the dynamics of national identity, conflict, and development in the context of migration, particularly within the Global South. In addition to having published in top journals such as the American Political Science Review and the Journal of the American Statistical Association, Dr. Zhou is currently working on several fascinating projects, including her own book project about the politics of national identification and claims-making behaviors of minority citizens in response to co-ethnic refugees and how governments are choosing to manage them. Her research isn't just theoretically important, but is also methodologically innovative and resourceful. And she draws on a range of approaches, including survey experiments, georeferenced observational data, and is also developing new statistical methods for asking sensitive survey questions. And on a fun personal note, Dr. Zhou and I had actually first met over half a decade ago now when we were both enrolled in the same graduate student seminar on immigrant integration, which must have had some kind of influence on both of our academic trajectories. And I can speak on behalf of both of us when I say that it is so wonderful to be able to find an intellectual home with the UBC Migration Research Cluster. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Zhou so that she can make the argument that prolonged social contact to internally displaced migrants does not reduce prejudice amongst locals in wartime settings. Take it away, Dr. Zhou.
Hi, everyone. First, Amanda, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you to UBC Migration for hosting my talk today. So this is joint work with Jason Lyall, who's an associate professor at Dartmouth. And the motivation for this project and what motivates practically all of my research, it starts with the global displacement crisis that we're currently in. So currently there are almost 80 million people, or 1% of the world's population, who are forcibly displaced. And that's an unprecedented number, and unfortunately, it is growing every year. We can see from this figure that within that number, that 80 million number, the majority are actually internally displaced people. That's the blue line, IDPs. These are people who have been forced to flee their homes, but they remain within their country's boundaries. And the number of IDPs vastly surpass the number of refugees at 26 million. That's the yellow line. These are refugees are people who've been forced to flee, but leave their country's boundaries. So here we can see that internal displacement is a pressing international humanitarian issue. It has broad consequences for local security and stability. And like refugees, we know that these populations often face prejudice where they settle. So that brings us to the research question that drives this project, which is, can prolonged social contact reduce local residents' prejudice towards internally displaced persons in fragile and violent settings? And before I get further, I just want to say that the way we define prejudice in this project is prejudice is a set of negative beliefs about or attitudes toward an individual based solely on membership in a particular social group or category. So in this case, the social group or category we're interested in is migrant status. So our project seeks to speak to and build on this really vast literature, starting in social psychology, on intergroup contact. And this literature is really rooted in Gordon Allport's work. He was working in the 1950s, and specifically he was studying desegregation, racial desegregation efforts in the US in institutions like the military and public education. And he came up with the contact hypothesis, which posits that interpersonal contact between people from two different groups that cross some social identity boundary, this could be race or religion or gender, that interpersonal contact can promote tolerance, can promote friendships, and reduce prejudice for that other group under certain conditions. These conditions are equal status among the groups, that they're working towards a common goal and that they're cooperating together, and that this contact is supported by local institutions, social norms, and authorities. And so far, a lot of this literature has been very positive, showing that intergroup contact can reduce prejudice. But the problem is most of this work so far has been observational, meaning largely through self-reported surveys. So people tend to say that people who report having more contact with another group also tend to report saying that they have less prejudice for the other group. But we know that this kind of evidence can suffer from selection bias, right? It could be that less prejudiced people seek out more contact to begin with. So there's been few experiments, but recently a few large-scale meta-studies have started looking at these experiments, and they find that many of the experiments that have been done in a lab setting. So there's few experimental work that take place in a real-world setting, and very few work done in non-Western contexts. One such study by Matt Lowe, who's my colleague here at UBC BSE, he recently did a really cool project looking at intercaste cricket groups in India. I encourage you to check that out. But there are two recent experiments or randomized control trials done in conflict settings that we think our project speaks most closely to. And the first was done in Nigeria by Alex Gacko and Shana Warren, where they are randomizing young men who are Christian or Muslim in Nigeria into taking a computer class together. And they randomize whether these classes are homogenous or mixed groups between Christians and Muslims. And within the mixed group classrooms, whether there are homogenous homework pairs or mixed homework pairs. And they find, unfortunately, that attitudes don't really change for the mixed group classrooms. In fact, over time, it's actually the homogenous classrooms that get more prejudiced. The other study is a recent study by Salma Musa, and this paper was the cover story of Science. This is really cool. She did this project in Iraq, where she was looking at soccer teams, all Christian soccer teams, and she randomized for some teams whether they received 3 more players who were also Christian, or they received 3 more players who were Muslim. And here she finds effects where attitudes do change for these Christians who've received Muslim players, but they only extend to those specific players. They don't extend to Muslims as a whole. So here in this article, she's arguing that intergroup contact may change our attitudes to those people who, specific people we have contact with, but really it just enlarges this mental fence. It doesn't take down that fence altogether. What we're bringing with our study is we're highlighting an overlooked social identity status, a status that hasn't been studied much in this literature, which is migrant status. So there's been lots of work based on race or religion, ethnicity, gender, not so much done on how people feel about migrants. And to do so, we're drawing on a very large literature on public attitudes towards migrants. And the attitudes we're going to study really come from this literature. So negative attitudes in terms of how migrants affect local security, economic prospects, job opportunities, examples like that. So now let me describe the program that we're testing and the context. We did this work in Afghanistan, which has one of the largest IDP populations in the world. At the time when we were doing the study in 2015 and 2016, there was 1.35 million IDPs in Afghanistan. I think currently the number has risen to around 3 million. Our study is in the province of Kandahar, and at the time it was hosting 125,000 IDPs. And we think Afghanistan offers a very important example of war-induced population displacement. It has local migrant antagonism in this area, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And, you know, a legacy of nearly 4 decades of war, drought, natural disasters, political instability. And so we think this project really generalizes to other conflict settings in the world. As I said, the study was done in late 2015, 2016. Our partner was Mercy Corps. It's a very large international NGO that looks at conflict. They designed this program called INVEST. It is a vocational skills training program. So participants come, they can choose between 14 different classes that focuses on imparting vocational skills. So classes like computer software or fixing mobile phones or plumbing. The point of this program was really just to teach vocational skills. It had nothing to do with prejudice reduction. There was no explicit programming for prejudice reduction. And so we think that minimizes reporting bias, and it also minimizes self-selection into the program. The participants of this program was 2,500 men and women, which is also pretty new. Most of these studies usually focus on young men. And they were randomized into either taking the courses now, so that's our treatment group, or put into the control group, meaning they were put on a wait list to take the classes later on. So in the end, everyone got to take the classes. We're just randomizing between whether they take it now or later. What's interesting about this project is that nearly half of the participants here were internally displaced. They were IDPs. So unlike other studies where they're just bringing in, a few people from the outgroup, here they're really on equal status. The IDPs were not tokenized individuals. And so we think this really met the condition, and the very important condition for a contact hypothesis, which is equal status. The courses themselves lasted either 3 or 6 months. They met 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. This is a really long time for the 6-month courses. That's 720 total hours together. Most of these studies looking at intergroup contact look at contact over the course of a day in a lab setting, or for that Nigeria and Iraq study we were talking about, I think it was around like 60 hours or 30 hours, total hours. So this project tests basically one of the longest, we think, examples of intergroup contact. It's a really intensive period of contact. Also, the class composition ranged from either around 30% of the class were IDPs all the way to 60%. So again, basically equal footing. The IDPs were not vastly outnumbered, nor did they vastly outnumber the locals in the classroom. We also conducted post-program focus groups and interviews, and participants told us that they were highly satisfied with the courses. We had quite high compliance, meaning they did come to class. And just overall, we think this is a really naturalistic test of contact theory. Our participants were living in real conflict conditions. And even though, this is really important to note, the main groups in conflict were not locals versus migrants, unlike, in other settings where the groups in conflict are, for example, Christians versus Muslims in Nigeria. These aren't, what we're studying here, they're not lab-induced group identities. There are real tensions that exist between these groups. And so we're fairly confident in the external validity of the study. Second, we know that participants worked together. They collaborated, they cooperated together in these natural classroom settings. They were not engineered into intergroup pairings like some other studies. And again, there was no explicit programming towards prejudice reduction or migration. And since this program focused on skills training and not prejudice reduction, again, we think it avoids the problem of self-selection and reporting bias.
Yang, may I interject with a question from the audience? Matthew
Yes.
Wright was wondering, can you give some background on the nature of the prejudice at baseline in this case context?
Yes, I'm going to get there in a few slides. That's an excellent question. So just a couple photos from the study. We had permission to take these photos just to give you a sense of what it looked like. Here are the women, some of the women in our study. Here's some of the men in the classroom setting. And so here I'm going to show you a map of, in red, the red triangles are the vocational training centers. These are where the classes took place. 2 of them are men only, 1 of them was women only, and the last one was mixed gender. And you can see that they're in Kandahar city and sort of in the surrounding areas of Kandahar city. The blue circles are IDP camps or settlements, and they're sized by their population. So you can also see here that IDPs were sort of geographically interspersed in this area. And they were definitely a part of the target population of participants. Here's some quick demographics of who our participants were by whether they were IDPs, these are the white bars, or locals, these are the dark gray bars. We can see that within our study, they have many similar characteristics to each other. Everyone in our program tended to be very young, so the mean age was around 20. And that was on purpose. Mercy Corps really wanted to target young people who might have been susceptible to Taliban recruitment. And so they're young, they're largely of Pashtun ethnicity, which we also know is it's co-ethnic with largely the Taliban. So again, vulnerable or susceptible to Taliban recruitment. On average, they have about 7 to 8 years of formal education, 1 year of madrasa education. And they are largely unemployed. I think only 28% of our participants were employed at baseline. 77% reported earning no income at all in the past month. And so these vocational skills training classes were really important for them to build their skills, to try and get a job or start a business afterwards. So just overall, between our displaced and our local participants, they tended to be young and quite poor. I also really wanted to upfront the ethical considerations that we had, especially with this type of experimental work in global South context, in conflict context. We recognized, of course, that we're working with a very vulnerable population who are experiencing active conflict and chronic or underemployment. To really just be mindful of that, Mercy Corps fielded the program a year prior to our study to make sure that they weren't, that the program wasn't having any unintended harmful effects. They've been running a similar program in other parts of Afghanistan and many places of the world, actually, in Somalia, just in other conflict areas in Nigeria. And so they really tested out this program to make sure it was effective. In terms of our survey work, which was going to be how we measure our main outcomes of interest of attitudes, we obtained informed consent on all the surveys. We didn't use any deception in our surveys. We made sure that participants knew that they could end the interview at any time, and that their standing in the classes had nothing to do with the surveys. It wasn't contingent on how they answered. We also organized safe travel and paid transportation for our participants to go to and from the VTCs, the vocational training centers. And we conducted focus groups and interviews with the participants and the teachers of the classes throughout in order to probe for any negative experiences, and we didn't hear any. Okay, so now you might be wondering, is there discrimination in this area against migrants, and what does that look like? I think that gets a little bit to Matt's question. Some background on the IDPs that were participating in our program. Most of them were displaced due to Taliban violence, but some were also displaced, they said, due to government violence or natural disasters. You can see next that 60% of them were always IDPs. They were displaced within Afghanistan, but 40% actually were refugees for a while in Pakistan, and they returned to Afghanistan. They're displaced within Afghanistan. So here we call them returning IDPs. Also, unsurprisingly, most of them were displaced, after 2001 when the US war in Afghanistan began. And they've been, for those who are in Pakistan, they've been returning, in the past decade and a half. From our focus group and interview evidence, we would hear things like, this first quote comes from a migrant in our program. A member of my extended family was a victim of a robbery. Criminals attacked him, beat him robbed money from his small business. Without local connections, because he is an IDP, he was not able to get any help from the police to complain. One of our training center directors also told us something similar, that migrants in Kandahar face miserable conditions, that there's this belief among locals that migrants had saturated the job market and were taking jobs from local Kandaharis. So what are our hypotheses? What are we testing here? We have four main hypotheses in this project. First, that the local participants in the project were treated. Afterwards, they're going to report more positive views of IDPs, hence prejudice reduction. They're also going to report more interactions with migrants in general outside of the program. That too, these positive effects should be greater for locals who are taking 6 months classes as opposed to the 3-month classes, given the larger dosage. They're having many more hours together with migrants. That those who are in balanced courses, meaning in terms of numbers, it's more like 50% locals and migrants, that they should also see larger and longer effects. And this follows directly from the original contact hypothesis that there should be equal footing. And lastly, that younger participants will also see larger and longer positive effects compared to older participants. Because what we do know from this work in intergroup contact is it seems that like children and young people, their minds are easier to change. Once we get older, some of our biases and prejudices seem to be set. So how do we measure our main outcome of interest, of prejudice? And here I'm also going to show you our what we see at baseline. So again, that's going to get to Matt's question. We conducted a survey right at the end of the program, so an end line, and then we conducted the same survey again 8 months later. So we're really looking not just at the immediate effects, but also very long-term effects. And on the survey, we asked this set of questions. The first question, thinking about the past 6 months, approximately how much interaction did you have with displaced people in your community? In the local context, they're just called refugees. So this first question is on self-reported behavior of levels of interaction. And it's a scale from 0 to 5, from never to daily. Number 2, in general, what kind of effect do you feel that refugees, displaced people have on your community? So this is just an overall, either very negative or very positive, scale from 1 to 5. Then we include 3 statements that sort of inspired from the immigration literature on concerns that locals might feel about migrants. So some people believe that these refugees are more likely to support violence than local residents, will take employment away from native residents, will become a burden on government resources by requiring welfare assistance. Some people believe that, but others disagree. What do you think? Do you, really disagree with the statement or really agree with the statement? And again, these questions are a scale from 1 to 5. And so this is what we see on those questions at baseline. So baseline is before any of the programming has taken place. Across all of our local participants, for the first question, you're seeing that in terms of interaction with the displaced, about half of them report that they've never had an interaction with the displaced, I think in the past 6 months. And so very low reported interaction. The next question, just the overall perception. And going to the other 3 questions as well, we actually see that this looks pretty normal. meaning that, you know, there is variation here. Most people will put themselves somewhere in the middle. There are some people who, you know, say they're very unfavorable or are very, you know, prejudiced against the migrants. That's the leftmost bar. But there are some people who, you know, aren't very prejudiced at the very right. Most people fall somewhere in the middle. And I think this tells us a few things. It tells us that there is variation here. There definitely is prejudice, but it's not so skewed to one side. It's not so deep-seated where we might see in other contexts. So for example, in that Nigeria or the Iraq study, the two groups are in conflict with each other. And so for them, these questions would look really skewed to the left side. And so we think, while there is prejudice, maybe this is a type of situation where we can really change minds, because the animosity does not seem to be as deep-seated. So we were actually very optimistic that, you know, this is a context where our treatment is very long, and people aren't so prejudiced against each other yet. Moving on to the
clarifying question.
Yes.
From Mohammed Salihin Subhan. He's asking for the survey questions, just to clarify, was there a middle option or were respondents forced to pick on either side?
There was a middle option. So from 1 to 5, 3 was neither agree nor disagree. Good question. Any other clarifying?
Yeah, I see two longer questions from Travis and Angia, and they seem like good ones for the Q&A.
Okay, thanks for moderating. So moving on to the results here, our title basically gives away our results. Here I'm showing you at the top graph results from end line 1, so right when the program ended. And at the bottom, these are going to be results from end line 2. This is the same survey done 8 months later. In black here is just the overall effect. This is asking all of our local participants and comparing the difference in means between the treated group and the control group. And just taking a quick look across all of these estimates, you can see that they're pretty tightly around 0. They are not statistically different from 0. And they're actually quite precise nulls because, again, our scale is, they either go from 0 to 5 or 1 to 5. So you can tell from our y-axis that here, all of these estimates are pretty precise nulls, which means that no minds were changed overall. No attitude change, just null effects. Next, we can compare those who were in the 3-month versus the 6-month classes. To just be very transparent, we did not randomize 3 or 6-month classes. Participants chose that when they joined the program, but we did match when we, on 3 versus 6 month, we blocked on it before we did the randomization. But look, a similar story emerges, right? We have null effects for 3 months and 6 months. So duration does not seem to matter. And lastly, we can look at class composition. Were they majority displaced, pretty balanced, or minority displaced in the classroom? Again, looking across this is mostly null effects. In fact, for the second question on overall perception of the displaced, at end line 1, we see that locals who were in classrooms that were majority displaced actually ended up reporting a bit more negative attitudes. At end line 2, strangely, it's those in balanced classes who report more negative attitudes. I wouldn't put too much into that because when we ran multiple hypothesis testing analysis, everything is basically null. So what I want you to take away from this graph is that For all of our hypotheses 1 through 3, we're just getting null effects. Even in a context where we think the program was naturalistic, it was well designed, students received it well, there weren't deep-seated conflicts and biases yet. And now we can look at the results based on the locals, their own demographics. So we can look at gender. Does it matter if they're women or men? Not really. It's also null across the board. Does it matter if they were younger or older? And this speaks to our fourth hypothesis, where we thought younger people, their minds would be easier to change. And we don't see a difference there either. Does it matter if they were of Pashtun or not Pashtun ethnicity, which is the dominant ethnicity, but also co-ethnic with the Taliban? And here we see that non-Pashtun seem to, at end line 1, report even less interaction with the displaced. But again, this effect washes away with multiple hypothesis testing. We were also curious to see if it mattered if they reported they themselves being previously harmed. This comes from a literature where maybe empathy is more likely when you yourself have a past history with displacement or having experienced violence. We didn't have that many people who reported that they were harmed, so we couldn't look at effects for them, but at least for those who reported that they weren't harmed, also no differences here in the results. Okay, so in conclusion, it's a big null results paper. It was really disheartening for my co-author and me, for Mercy Corps. Disheartening, but we think it's really important. It's really important to put null results out there, given that, we know there's publication bias in lots of work out there. And so, if we want to learn something about the world, we need to get the full picture. And so many of these studies, we think, because they have null results, they might have been locked away in a file drawer. It's important to know, especially if these programs, these types of programs, which we know cost millions and millions of dollars, if their aim is to reduce prejudice, I think we should know when and if it works and when it doesn't work. Even though our study was different in a lot of different ways from the Skacko and Warren study in Nigeria and the Salma Musa study in Iraq, our findings are largely in line with theirs, which is that prejudicial beliefs may just be too difficult to budge, particularly in active wartime settings. Some limitations of our study that we'd love to explore in future work. You notice that all of our outcomes were survey outcomes. We didn't get a chance to explore behavioral changes. There's some really cool work done to try and measure behavior. For example, in the Musa paper, she gives her participants the opportunity to come to a dinner with people of the opposite religion and see if they show up. And there's some work showing that maybe attitudes and beliefs are hard to change, but it might actually be easier to move behaviors. So that would be really interesting. I think it'd also be really interesting to look at cross-cutting identities. So does it matter, not just that you're in a classroom with migrants, but maybe you're in a classroom with co-ethnic migrants versus non-co-ethnic migrants? That's not something we were able to randomize. And then just thinking about what's next, right? We're dealing with a big null results paper. You might be thinking, okay, we know that this doesn't work. What might work? Maybe we actually need more explicit anti-prejudice programming within the program itself. Things like perspective giving, in which the marginalized group, in our case, migrants, might take an hour to just talk about their personal experiences. Or programming like perspective taking, in which locals might have to imagine themselves in the shoes of a migrant and what kind of decisions would they make. There is some supportive evidence. I'm citing here Josh Calla and David Brockman's work, or Clara Dita, Adeline Lowe, Melina Plata's work that shows that there is some medium, mostly short-term effects with these types of interventions. And lastly, I'll just leave you with maybe a more sort of controversial thought, taking a step back. This comes from my advisor, Betsy Levy-Palek's new paper with Roni Parat, Chelsea Clark, and Don Green, where they are doing a big meta-analysis of all these anti-prejudice prejudice reduction interventions. And they also find mostly null effects looking across many, many different studies. And they're arguing that maybe having all these interventions, spending millions of dollars on these interventions that are aimed at changing minds, aimed at cognitive and psychological changes within individuals, is not enough. And what we really need is to just do much harder work in making structural changes in the institutions around us. And that's what I've been thinking a lot about these days doing this work. And I'll leave you with that. I'm looking forward to your questions, your thoughts. Yeah, thank you so much.